I am Josephine, but everyone back in Cedar Ridge still calls me Jo. I am 58 years old, and for the past 15 years, my most sacred ritual has been visiting a slab of granite under an old willow tree. I thought I would do it until I could no longer walk. But on a gloomy Friday afternoon, as I was brushing fallen leaves from the headstone, my gaze drifted to the cemetery gate. A man walked past. That build, that turn of the shoulder. My heart stopped. It was Danny, my son, the one who died 15 years ago. Before I tell you how my world shattered and was rebuilt from that single glance, I want to know where you are listening to this from. Is it a quiet place or a busy space? Let me know down in the comments. And if you have ever held on to something longer than you should have, you might understand what comes next. Please hit that like button and subscribe to follow this journey with me. 15 years is a long time to build routines. Mine were Tuesdays and Fridays at 3 in the afternoon. I would park my old sedan in the same spot, walk past the rows of trimmed headstones, and settle on the small stone bench my husband Robert had installed next to the plot. I would talk. I would tell Danny about the weather, about the stubborn hollyhocks in my garden, about a funny thing Eleanor from next door had said. It was my chapel. The grass there was always a little greener, the shade a little cooler. That particular Friday, the sky was the color of a week-old bruise, yellowish gray. I remember the exact sound of the brittle oak leaves scraping against the marble as I swept them. I looked up maybe to check if it would rain, and that is when I saw him, walking on the sidewalk beyond the black iron gates, hands in his pockets, head slightly down. He was older, filled out, but the way his hair fell across his forehead, the slight hunch of his posture when he was lost in thought, it was a carbon copy. A wave of something cold and electric washed over me from my scalp down to my feet. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I just stared as he kept walking past the gate, past the old oak on the corner, and out of sight. The world shrank to the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. I sat down hard on the bench, my fingers gripping the cold stone until my knuckles ached. For 15 years I had tended a ghost, and in 1 second that ghost had just strolled back into the land of the living. In the days that followed, a strange calm descended on me. The initial shock froze me solid, but as it thawed, it left behind a sharp clinical clarity. I did not tell a soul, not Eleanor, who would have hugged me and called the doctor. Not anyone, because a part of me, the part that had accepted a closed casket and a jar of ashes, was terrified I had finally lost my mind. Grief playing the cruelest trick. But another part, the part that was a mother down to her marrow, knew. I had seen my child, so I began to watch. I changed my days. I went to the cemetery on a Monday morning, a Thursday evening. I sat in my car across the street from the coffee shop he had seemed to glance at. I became a silent investigator of my own broken life. I needed proof, something tangible to hold on to before the vision dissolved into madness. That need led me to the attic, to the boxes I had not opened since we carried them up there after the funeral. Robert could not bear it, and I had lacked the courage. The air was thick with dust and memory. I found his senior yearbook, his baseball glove stiff and cracked. And then at the bottom of a box marked Danny's room, I found a simple black composition notebook, his journal. My hands shook as I opened it. The entries were not daily. They were bursts of feeling. Phrases jumped out at me. Feel like I'm suffocating here. Dad talks about the plant, like it's my destiny. It feels like a life sentence. Met a guy named Jake in the city. He gets it. Says there are ways to start over clean. The last entry, dated a week before the accident, read, I can't do this. The debt is one thing. The disappointment is another. I need an exit. Jake says he knows a way. It sounds crazy, but maybe crazy is the only way out. I sat on the attic floor, the journal in my lap, the dust motes dancing in a sliver of sunlight. It was not proof of life. It was proof of desperation. A desperation I had been too blinded by my own ideas of his future to see. Armed with these fragments of a past, I never knew I did something out of character. I invited Eleanor over for tea. We sat in my sunroom surrounded by my hanging plants. Do you remember? I asked, trying to keep my voice light like I was just reminiscing what Danny was like right before. Eleanor, bless her, sipped her tea and thought. He was quiet Joe, preoccupied. I remember once he helped me carry groceries and he asked if I ever thought about just disappearing, starting fresh somewhere. Nobody knew my name. I told him everyone thinks that sometimes. He just nodded like it was more than a thought for him. Her words landed like stones in my stomach. Disappearing, starting fresh. They echoed the journal perfectly. Later that week, I visited my lawyer, old Arthur Finch. I told him I was reviewing my estate planning and needed to see the file related to Danny's death for the insurance policies. He brought out a thin folder. The police report was succinct. Single car accident. Vehicle found at the bottom of Ravine Creek. Severe impact fire. No remains recoverable for visual identification. Identification based on personal effects found at the scene wallet. Class, ring a charred piece of a Letterman jacket. My eyes stuck on a line in the officer's supplemental notes. Scene suggests high speed. No indication of other vehicles, though fragments of unknown blue paint transferred on passenger side guardrail. Unknown blue paint. It was a tiny thread frayed and loose. A week after my first sighting on a Tuesday, I saw him again. He came out of the hardware store carrying a small bag. This time I followed. Not on foot but in my car, my hands slick on the wheel, keeping a block behind. He walked into the Daily Grind, the coffee shop opposite the cemetery. I parked. I watched through the large front window as he smiled at the girl behind the counter, said something that made her laugh. He took his coffee to a table by the window and opened a book. The afternoon sun fell on his face. I saw the small pale scar above his left eyebrow. From a childhood tumble off his bike. Every detail etched itself into me with painful precision. This was no hallucination. This was my son Daniel Miller drinking coffee and reading a book 15 years after we buried him. I got out of the car. The pavement felt unsteady under my feet. I walked across the street, pushed open the door to the coffee shop, and the bell chimed. The smell of roasted beans and steamed milk hit me. The cozy chatter of the place seemed to recede into a distant hum. I walked straight to his table. He looked up, a polite, inquiring smile on his face for a stranger. It faltered. His eyes, the same hazel green as my father's, widened. The color drained from his face, leaving it ashen. The book slipped from his fingers and thumped on the table. "Danny," I said. My voice was a dry whisper, barely audible. He flinched, as if struck. I think you have the wrong person," he stammered, starting to rise. "I have visited your grave every week for 15 years. I said a little louder, each word a chip of ice. The couple at the next table stopped talking. He looked around, panic flashing in his eyes. "Not here," he hissed, leaning forward. "Please, the park, the bench behind the library. 1 hour." He threw a $5 bill on the table, grabbed his book, and practically ran out the side door. The hour that followed was the longest of my life. I sat on a different bench in the park, watching ducks on the pond, feeling absolutely nothing. Just a vast, hollow numbness. When I finally walked to the secluded bench behind the red brick library, he was already there, pacing. He looked up, trapped. "Mom," he said, and the word, after all this time, was a physical blow. He told me everything in a rushed, choked voice. The gambling debt from a stupid weekend in Portland. The threatening calls. The shame. The overwhelming pressure from Robert to join the family business, to be a man he felt he could never be. The minor fender bender on the mountain road that gave him the insane, desperate idea. Jake, the friend, helped him stage it. Leave the personal items. Send the car over the edge. Disappear. He thought he would go away, work under the table, pay off the debt, and come back in a few years a success. But a few years turned into more. The lie became a life. The fear of the legal consequences, insurance fraud, obstructing justice, kept him silent. He built a new life 2 towns over. A new name, David Nash. A quiet job at a print shop. "I wanted to tell you." He wept, his head in his hands. 1,000 times I picked up the phone. But the longer it went on, I was a coward. I listened. I didn't interrupt. When he finished, the hollow inside me filled with a cold, heavy certainty. Your father died of cancer. I said, my tone flat, devoid of the tempest raging inside. Maybe the grief helped it along. I have lived with a grave. And you have just been living for your own convenience. I stood up. He reached for my hand. I pulled away. I looked at this man, my son, and saw a stranger. I turned and walked away, leaving him sobbing on the bench. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't stay there. For days I moved through my house like one of my own ghosts. The grief I had carried for 15 years was a familiar worn blanket. This new grief was an open wound, raw and septic. I wasn't just mourning my son anymore. I was mourning the story of my son. The narrative of tragic loss that had defined my middle age was a lie. I felt unmoored foolish. The headstone was a monument to my own naivete, but slowly, like a cold engine turning over anger, began to replace the numbness. It wasn't a screaming, fiery anger. It was a deep, simmering resolve. I was angry at him, yes, but I was also angry at the shoddy police work, at the system that had been so easily satisfied, at myself for not asking more questions. I needed to act, not for revenge, but for truth, for a reckoning. I made an appointment with Sheriff Ben Hayes. He had been Robert's friend. He had held my hand at the funeral. His office smelled of old coffee and wood polish. Joe, he said, concern lining his face. What can I do for you? I laid it out calmly, clearly. I told him I had seen Daniel Miller alive. I saw the disbelief, the pity in his eyes. He started with the gentle phrases. Grief does funny things, Joe. The mind can play tricks. I cut him off. I told him about the journal entries, about Eleanor's recollection. And then I described the man in minute detail down to the childhood scar above his left eyebrow. His name is David Nash now. He works at Precision Print in Milford. Ben's expression changed. The paternal concern hardened into professional scrutiny. He sighed a heavy, weary sound. Joe, if this is true, he's looking at a world of trouble. False report, insurance fraud, maybe more. It's a mess. What do you want to do? I looked him straight in the eye. My voice was steady. I don't want him in prison, Ben. I've had enough of loss. But I want the truth made official. I want that grave to not have his name on it anymore. And I want him, Daniel, to have to stand up and formally face what he did. In front of me and in front of the law. No more shortcuts. With Ben's reluctant agreement and my lawyer, Arthur Finch's guidance, I set the terms. I was done being a passive character in this story. We arranged a meeting, not a family reunion, a formal deposition. It was held in Arthur's sober, book-lined office. Ben was there. Arthur was there. Daniel came with a young public defender. He'd hired a woman who looked nervous. I sat in a high-backed leather chair, my hands folded in my lap. I said almost nothing. I made Daniel tell the entire story again, from the beginning, to these official witnesses. He had to say it, all the debt, the fear, the staged accident, the 15 years of silence. He stammered, he cried, he looked at me pleadingly. I just looked back, my face a calm mask. It was excruciatingly powerful, making him accountable in that room. When he finished, the air was thick. Then I spoke. I laid out my conditions. First, full cooperation to legally reverse his death certificate and amend all records. Second, he would bear all costs and legal burdens to dissolve his old identity and address any fraud allegations. Third and most important, he would come with me to Cedar Ridge Cemetery, and he would be the one to remove the headstone that bore his name. A week later, we all stood there, again Ben, Arthur, Daniel and me. The sky was overcast. Daniel's hands were shaking as he took the crowbar Arthur had brought. He looked at me one last time, a silent plea for mercy. I gave none. I nodded toward the stone. He worked the tool behind the granite slab, his muscles straining. With a grating sound of stone on stone, it came loose and tilted forward onto the grass. The sound of it landing was final. It was over. I picked up the small sealed urn that had been buried beneath it, the anonymous ashes we had mourned. I held it in my hands. It felt weightless, meaningless. Daniel stood there, sweat on his brow, looking at the empty space where his monument had been. Life did not magically reset. In the months that followed, I navigated a new awkward landscape. I did not banish Daniel, but I did not welcome him home as a prodigal son. We had coffee sometimes. The conversations were stilted, filled with landmines of memory and regret. He was sorry, truly sorry, but his apology lived in a house I could no longer inhabit. My healing had to be my own. I signed up for a pottery class at the community center. Getting my hands dirty in cold, wet clay, creating something from formless earth, was profoundly therapeutic. It had no connection to my past. I made new friends there who knew nothing of Josephine Miller's tragedy. The story did leak out in our small town, of course. There were whispers at the grocery store, sympathetic head tilts. Eleanor became my fierce defender. I learned to hold my head up, to accept their curiosity, until it faded, which it eventually did. I saw Daniel trying to find his footing in his fractured life, burdened by a remorse that seemed his true punishment. I realized the greatest consequence for him wasn't from me or the law. It was having to live with the man he had chosen to become. One afternoon, I drove past the cemetery. I slowed down and looked through the gates. The spot under the willow tree was just a patch of grass, now slightly uneven. I felt no pull to go in, no compulsion to tend to anything there. I just kept driving. For the first time in 15 years, I was moving forward without looking back. Healing, I learned, is not a straight line. It is a slow, deliberate walk through a field still littered with shrapnel. I did not forgive him quickly. Forgiveness, I decided, is not a one-time event you announce. It is a daily choice not to let the hurt and the anger steer your heart. I had to separate the love I had for the little boy I raised from the truth of the man he became. The deepest lesson wasn't about family or blood being thicker than water. It was this: we can live inside a story for so long that it becomes our only home, no matter how shaky its foundation. Real courage isn't about clinging to that story. It is about having the strength to dismantle it, even when it means standing in an empty space with nothing over your head. And from that emptiness, you can finally begin to build something that is truly your own. I am still Josephine Miller. I am 58. I still knit, but now I also throw pots. Sometimes I talk to my son on the phone. Sometimes we sit in silence. Life isn't a neatly wrapped, happy ending. It just goes on differently. And I think finally, after 15 years, I have really begun to live. Not in the shadow of a grave, but under this complicated, imperfect sunlight. So I will leave you with this question. What story have you been holding on to that might be ready to be laid down? If this story touched a place in your heart or made you think of your own journeys, I would love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Have you ever had to rewrite a story you thought was true? Let's have a conversation. If you found some strength or peace in my journey, please give this video. Like it, lets me know these stories matter. And if you want to join me for more real raw conversations about life, loss, and finding our way back, please hit that subscribe button and share this with someone who might need to hear it today. Thank you for listening, for sharing this time with me. Wishing you the courage to face your own truths and the peace that comes after.